Hey everyone, we've made it to our fourth and final forum of our national conference. The topic is maximizing the power of the Latino vote. And here to lead the discussion, we have an award-winning editor, reporter, and columnist at the Arizona Republic, the Daily Times, Tucson Citizen, and with the Associated Press. Please help me welcome the Vice President of Public Policy at Chicanos por la Causa, a 501c3 nonprofit social services organization with operations in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, and Nevada. Please help me welcome Joseph Garcia.
Good day. I'm Joseph Garcia, Vice President of Public Policy at Chicanos por la Causa, also Executive Director of CPLC Action Fund, which is our sister 501c4 advocacy organization. Our panel discussion is an important one leading up to the 2022 midterm election, maximize the power of the Latino vote. We have an all-star cast here to talk about this. It's going to be a conversation, interested in the answers. Joining us are Rafael Coyoso. He's the former U.S. HLI Northeast Regional Coordinator who's now heading up Unidos U.S. Action Fund as its Executive Director. Also, we got Nathalie Reyes, President and CEO of the Latino Victory Fund. And also we have with us joining us is Mark Hugo Lopez, who's Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at Pew Research Center. So thank you for joining us, Mark. Let's start with you. Nationwide, Latinos cast 16.6 million votes into 2020, an increase of about 31% over the 2016 presidential election. By comparison, overall, the increase was about 31%. Turnout was about 16% among all voters of all races. So it was about half of what Latinos did in the turnout in percentage-wise. There's always a big dip when it comes to the midterm, though. Do you expect those percentages to hold up in November with Latino participation perhaps even increasing? Or is there the danger of Latino voter turnout taking a step backward and thereby political clout for Latinos thereby taking a step backward as well?
I think it remains to be seen what will happen in this coming election cycle in terms of Latino voter turnout. But just to talk about patterns over the years. So yes, Latino voter turnout rose significantly in 2020 compared to 2016. It did for the general public too, but as you noted, it grew faster for Latinos than it did for the general public. What's interesting is that 2018, the last midterm election, was also a year where the U.S. public turned out to vote in record numbers, at least for a recent midterm election, and Latinos were no different. In fact, what was interesting about 2018 is that Latino voter turnout was reaching presidential levels that we had seen in 2012 or in 2008, and that in and of itself is significant because it shows that you can have a significant Latino voter turnout almost at presidential election year levels with engagement and with, of course, an election that drives many folks to the polls. For 2022, I'm not quite sure what will happen. I think it remains to be seen. Will the pandemic still be in place? Will many states continue to have in place some of the changes that they made to facilitate voting for voters? In other words, voting by mail, not having to go to the polls because of COVID, et cetera. And also, what interest will the public have in this coming election? I think it remains to be seen where we'll be, but there's certainly history behind this to show that Latinos can turn out in significant numbers at almost presidential levels in a midterm, given the right circumstances.
Thank you. And Nathalie, currently there are 47 members in the U.S. Congress who are Latino or Hispanic American. 40 are in the House of Representatives, 4 are in the U.S. Senate, and 3 are territorial delegates. What do those numbers say to you in terms of Latino representation in Washington? And what are your thoughts about Latino representation in elected office across the country?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's a pleasure to be with you here and amongst friends and with this great audience. Look, Latino Victory works to increase Latino representation at all levels of government, at the local, at the state, and obviously at the federal level. Latinos are almost 19% of the population in the United States, but we are less than 2%. Looking at those numbers, we're less than 2% of the elected officials at all levels of this government. If we truly want a representative government, which is the bedrock of this country, that reflects our nation's diversity, we must increase the numbers of Latinos elected to office. Latino Victory, here we always say that the demographics is not destiny, unfortunately. While Latinos have demographic advantages, which we know of, we're 32 million eligible voters, we must harness that power. Latino voter mobilization runs in tandem with electing more Latino candidates in races across this great country. Latino Victory has found that when Latino candidates run for office, and this is critically important, they engage Latino community in the nuanced manner and are able to mobilize these voters to turn out to vote. And that is our theory of change here at Latino Victory, that when Latinos are running culturally competent campaigns, engaging all of us to come out and vote. So, we need to do better. We need to do better with our numbers. We were very proud in this past election cycle in 2020, where we doubled the representation in the U.S. Senate. We went from 2 Democratic Latino senators to 4, which is historical, with Alex Padilla from California and with Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico. But we must do better. We are doing better. And with more people running and with more Latinos ensuring that they're coming out to vote, we'll win more races. So this is just the beginning of a mobilization effort in ensuring that Latinos do come out and vote, and equally as important, that Latinos are running for all these offices, from local, state to federal offices. We need to see more Latinos running in order to have that powerful seat at the table, at all decision-making tables.
Thank you. Rafael, 6 in 10 Latino voters backed Democrat Joe Biden for president in 2020, yet Republican Donald Trump, despite his harsh rhetoric and policies regarding immigration and other key Latino issues, saw his share of the Latino vote increase by 8 percentage points compared to 2016. Was that a case of the Democratic Party taking Latino vote for granted? Or do those numbers even say anything anymore, given that a recent Wall Street Journal survey found that the Latino vote is now essentially split between the 2 major parties?
It's a critical question. First, thank you, Joe, for that question, and appreciate you emceeing this very important conversation here at the USHLE conference. I'm so proud to be part of this conversation as a proud USHLE alum, having worked for this fantastic organization and supported this organization my whole adult life. Special shout out to our fearless leader, Dr. Juan Andrade, a true icon, civil rights champion in our community. And it's so ironic that we're having this conversation in 2022, still having to scratch and claw and fight for Latino and minority voting rights, when Dr. Juan Andrade was one of the leaders of that fight in Texas decades ago. And it's just a blessing to still have him with us for his guidance. But directly to get to your question, Joe, I think it's pretty clear that in 2020, Latinos were raising their voices. Mark, our great statistician, and that documents these trends so incredibly well, and my great partner in advocacy work, Nathalie at Latino Victory Fund, can attest that in 2020 was truly a historic election for Latino turnout. But just as importantly, Latinos been a very strong message, not just on political preference, but that they want to be heard. And so some of the shortcomings, I think it's safe to say, of the Democratic mobilization efforts, particularly in communities like South Florida, South Texas, but broadly across the board, was that the Democratic Party did not invest enough and with cultural competency in engaging our voters in the issues that they care about. And so when we go back and we talk to voters in South Texas or other parts of the country that maybe would not profile as someone that may vote for President Trump, but did, part of the answer that came out of that is that they weren't hearing from the Democratic Party enough around the issues that they cared about, around wanting to get back to work to support their families, sort of through this COVID, through this COVID era. and other issues that were affecting them day to day. And so it's critically important that whether it's Latino advocacy organizations, candidates, political parties, that we authentically engage our community, not just a few months ahead of time around election day with translated voter materials. And we have a real conversation with them about the issues they care about, and then show whether they're in the White House or advocacy organizations like Unidos UX Action Fund, that we're fighting and engaging in the issues that truly impact them. We've done studies, and Joe, you've been a part of this, where we've had some real eye-opening revelations as it relates to some of the issues they care about, like the impact of lower prescription drugs on the Latino community. And I point that example out because there's this stereotype that prescription drugs is sort of an issue that impacts old white people. But in fact, not only does the price of prescription drugs impact the Latino community, but it's an intergenerational issue because of pre-existing conditions like obesity and diabetes and other issues. We have people throughout in multi-generational families where there's someone in every generation in the family that gets impacted by the price of prescription drugs. So we have to listen to community and engage them in the issues that they care about.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's focus at the question at hand, how to maximize the Latino vote. What needs to be done differently going into the 2022 election, especially given the gerrymandering of districts and voter suppression laws being passed around the country, which target people of color, especially Latinos? Is all hope teetering on a national voter rights legislation, which looks somewhat doubtful at this point? Or do Latino voter organizations need to have a plan B in case that doesn't pass? We'll start with Nathalie.
So, I think that mobilization is critical. Talking to our community constantly is critically important. Campaigns and election cycles don't just roll in every 2 weeks before an election. We have to be constant with our messaging. We have to show Latinos exactly how we're delivering in Washington, at the state, and at the local level for them on a daily basis. We are persuasion voters. And and the bottom line is that old tactics of coming in a month beforehand simply will not work. We need to be talking to voters, especially Latino voters, always, constantly, and delivering for them the promises that we are, that we're keeping. So I think that that's critically important. And obviously, organizations like myself and Unidos and others that are doing the mobilizations are critically important. And our candidates are essential, ensuring that we have that, that pipeline of Latino candidates that are running at the local, state, and federal level and really mobilizing and talking to folks where they're at is critically important. And, fortunately or unfortunately, money matters. And so ensuring that we have the capacity financially to deliver the right messages to Latinos in culturally competent ways are critically important. And obviously, Latinos are not a monolith, and we need to keep that straight. A Mexican in Northern California is very different than a Mexican in Southern Texas. A Puerto Rican in New York is very different than a Puerto Rican in Tampa. A Venezuelan in Florida, again, is very different than a Guatemalteco in Chicago. So we have to realize that it's not a blanket campaign. Issues are different. And so, once we really live up to that, then I think that you'll see, just like we saw in 2018, just like we saw in 2020, great mobilization of Latinos coming out to vote, running for office, and ensuring that we are fighting for the policies and the issues that we care deeply about.
Rafael, your thoughts of this uphill battle to get more Latino voters engaged, especially during a pandemic, gerrymandering, voter suppression laws, a doubtful national voter rights legislation. What are your thoughts? What do we need to do?
Yeah, certainly much to do. And I think Nathalie definitely pointed us in the right direction around the need to not only continue to listen and engage the community, but I would take it even a step further and thinking about the good work that organizations like you at CPLC in Arizona do. We have to take it a step further to service our community, whether that's local elected officials with their constituent services, our nonprofit organizations with the day-to-day direct services that they provide, so we can continue to establish our credibility as trusted messengers, whether it's nonpartisan voter information or more partisan campaign advocate voter mobilization activity. I think that the beyond that, leadership matters, and just thinking about the idea that, as we see this incredible generation of new young elected officials in our community, largely women, who are, who are tend to be more successful in winning elections than their male counterparts in their own community, because they're willing to do the work and have already shown from their track record through other non-political roles that they're focused on service, and that's such an important part of engaging our community from a culturally competent perspective. And I think the last thing I'd like to say on this is that we have to share the urgency of this moment. And so while we're going to continue to fight for voting rights legislation, we've been in worse situations and more daunting situations when it's come to these battles around access to voting over the years and decades. But we have to let the community know what's at stake in this election from a democratic perspective, even beyond the issues, and really just lead with our truth and be authentic with our community in a culturally competent way. And I think we'll find that they will respond to that.
Thank you. Mark, 50% of voter eligible Latinos did not participate in the 2020 election. That's not surprising given the fact that there are essentially three groups of people who don't vote. Young people don't vote, poor people don't vote, people with less formal education don't vote, and Latinos fall into all three demographic categories. We're a young population, we're disproportionately poor, and 84% of Latinos have earned a bachelor's degree or higher from college. So, what does data suggest to you on what needs to be done in terms of targeted voters? Do we target and energize the younger Latino voters, or does data suggest that we maybe focus on the more established older Latino voters who perhaps haven't voted or vote very infrequently and just need to be vote more frequently?
It's a great question, and I think it's a question that ties in so much to the demography and the heterogeneity of the nation's Latino population. Let's talk about young people first, because a lot of the growth in the size of the Latino eligible voter pool, that is, people who are 18 years of age and a U.S. citizen, so they're eligible to vote, most of that growth is coming from young Latinos coming of age, U.S. born for the most part, and entering adulthood. Now, getting young people out to vote is a challenge, no matter their race or ethnicity. It's not just a matter of that they're young Latinos. It's, you find young Black Americans, young white Americans, young Asian Americans, young multiracial Americans, young Native Americans, all do turn out at lower rates than their adult counterparts. But in the case of Latinos, you'll see about an additional, for example, 2 million Latinos eligible to vote coming up in 2022. So that means we're talking about 33 to 34 million Latinos who are eligible to vote. Most of that growth, 3/4 of it, has come from young Latinos who've come of age. So if one wants to focus on raising the share of Latinos who are voting, one of the ways to do that is to focus on mobilizing young Latinos. Now, there's many ways to do that. Oftentimes, they just don't know where to go register to vote. Oftentimes, even if they are registered, they're not quite sure where to actually go cast a vote. And there's much more, of course, associated with it as well, with the laws that are in place in different states and how easy it is to register, especially if you've recently moved. If you're a college student, for example, where do you register? At your college, in the town where your college is located, or back home? These are all challenges that all young people face, but for Latino voters, this is perhaps more pronounced because of the relative presence of so many new voters every election. I'd say, though, that you're right, that there are other demographic characteristics associated with relatively lower voter turnout rates, like poverty and education, that are worth exploring as possibilities to perhaps focus some efforts to raise participation, because many of the same issues facing young people may also be facing those who are in these other groups, that is, registering for the first time, for example. But no matter what, I do think that no matter which group of Latino voters we're talking about, Latinos generally, whether younger or older, educated or not, immigrants or US born, turn out at rates that are lower than what you see for Americans who are not Hispanic in all of those categories. Nonetheless, I do think that we're starting to see some changes here. And that's really, I think, what 2018 and 2020 showed us, which is that you can get Latino voters out to vote in not only record numbers because of growing populations, but also record numbers because of engagement. And that's what I think we can take away from both 2018 and 2020.
Great. We've seen President Biden's approval ratings really plummet. Uh, we see inflation rising significantly. We know the continual problems, both in health related and economic related problems related to the pandemic. So there's a lot of issues going into the 2020 election race, even now as we speak. We'll start with Rafael, then go to Nathalie after that. Do you see us, for the Latino voter, going in with a steam of momentum due to the high turnout that we had in the last election? Or is there kind of going in there, we're going to have to win that voter enthusiasm once again, because there's a sense of perhaps disillusionment that perhaps nothing changed, and in some cases perhaps got worse?
Well, there's always sort of that natural enthusiasm gap that advocates have to address, in a midterm, after, especially when there's a new president, regardless of the party or circumstances, gets inaugurated 2 years before. And we obviously saw sort of not only record interest, but record investment on every side in engaging their own voters to turn out in 2020. So that's sort of baked in. I think that the what's so important is that our community, that before we even get into the phase of sort of turning out voters, we have to educate voters about the state of play, what's really happening in terms of not only from an economic perspective, but the impact of COVID relief, vaccinations, testing. What's how this impacting the quality of education for our children. How the child tax credit, which now has expired, but how we have a large chunk of Latinos in the community that never were able to apply for their child tax credit, or their newly eligible child tax credit, that we need to help educate and inform so that they can receive those benefits to support them through this time. So there's a lot of voter education that needs to take place. And I think the more and more that Latino voters see what's really happening here, not only sort of in our economy and sort of in our healthcare system as it relates to how this administration is addressing this new iteration of COVID, but that what's at stake in this election in 2022 around the issues that we want to continue to mobilize around. I think we'll see strong turnout from the Latino community relative to a midterm election.
Well, and I agree completely with Rafael. I think that, again, Latinos are persuasion voters. And so it is very important that we show how we've delivered for the American people, that Joe Biden and Democratic Party shows how we've delivered for the American people, to ensure that folks do come out and vote, and Latinos especially, how we've grown the economy, how we've, ensured that, COVID is under control, how, we've vaccinated, we've had free masks, we have, kits for to ensure that people are self-testing at home. And all of this is so critically important. It's, also, going back to school. I mean, we've talked about a little bit about education, the importance, that Latinos, see education as a forward momentum and movement of their children. And so, I think that, issues of the economy, job creation, healthcare, education, all of these things that that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party has promised, they need to deliver, and come and ensure that Latinos realize that this is how this party is delivering for the Latino community, and I think that creating that momentum is critically important, and I see a wave of candidates that are running that inspire me too. We have Latinos running across this great country for the local, state, and federal levels. And I think that they're going to create enthusiasm for Latinos to come out and vote as well, with their culturally competent ways of reaching out to Latino electeds. So I think all of those things are critically important. And also important is organizations like ours, we need to ensure that we focus on, registering people to vote, educating them on how to vote, if they want to vote by mail or in person or early voting, all these different ways, and ensuring folks make a plan to vote. So I think that, we have to continue that momentum of educating our community on how to vote and different ways of voting in different municipalities and states.
Joe, if I could add something, if you wouldn't mind, one of the things that I think we should share here during this panel is that while, and again, this is not the first newly minted president that had to deal with lagging approval ratings, but that while the approval ratings for the president are at a low ebb, our community supports this agenda as it relates to whether it's trying to get past and build back better, lowering prescription drugs, universal pre-K, expanded child tax credits, the environmental provisions. We are the greenest community politically in the country. If you look at us from a statistical perspective in terms of the issues that we care about. So it's incumbent on this administration and Congress to sort of finish the job, but this is the direction that our community wants our government to move in.
Thank you. Mark, how do you see it looking at, a bunch of data that you go through all the time, sifting through it? Is the Latino vote on the verge of being a powerhouse vote that every candidate's going to need to win in order to win an election? Or are we kind of viewed upon somewhat as an independent, because we vote both Democrat and sometimes we vote Republican, that we're kind of an independent, perhaps swing vote in the future until there's greater voter turnout, greater participation by Latino voters? How do you see the future going forward?
What seems to be emerging is that there's a realization that that Latino voters are diverse, and that one needs to perhaps tailor messages to reach Latino voters in different parts of the country, as Nathalie was saying, or one needs to focus on all the different ways and dimensions in which the demography of the nation's Latino population varies, because it does vary not just on origins, but also education levels, location in the country, and also how far somebody is away from their immigrant roots. Third generation Mexican Americans in Texas are very different than, say, recent immigrant arrivals in a place like, say, New York City. So paying attention to those distinctions, I think, are important. Will Latino voters become a key electorate or block in different parts of the country? I think we've already seen that in some places. That's true in a state like Florida, for example. It's been true for a while. And so I think that the stage is set for, in the coming elections, perhaps Latinos playing a bigger role, not just because of the size of their electorate, but also because it's not necessarily clear how strong support among Latinos will be for any one candidate from any one political party. We've kind of been here before, though. I want to stress that Trump's success with Latino voters in recent years is not much different from what we've seen in the past, in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, or in the early 2000s with George Bush. Latino voters have supported Republican candidates in somewhat different levels, depending on the candidate, depending on the issues. But there are so many factors that go into this. I think it remains to be seen how much and how big of an impact Latinos will have. But the stage certainly seems to be set. I think many have realized that Latino voters are not monolithic, that they are diverse, and that one must focus on reaching them in different ways, depending on what part of the country they live in, and also the characteristics of those communities. So let's see what happens moving forward. But I think the stage is set for Latino voters to be seen more as an important bloc to reach out to engage with, to be a part of the conversation in a way that maybe wasn't the case in the past. One last data point. In 2020, that was the first election where Latino eligible voters outnumbered the number of Black American eligible voters. In 2022, that's only going to become more pronounced, and by 2024, even more so. So Latino voters are on the verge of becoming the second largest racial or ethnic voting bloc in the country. Now, voting bloc is a term in quotes because I'm not sure that they are a voting bloc, but they are a group that is growing in size and in presence around the country.
Yes, certainly we can learn from our African American brothers and sisters when it comes to political empowerment and what that means, and demanding that we be heard as opposed to request to be heard. There's a big difference. Some final thoughts as we wrap this up that you might have that you want to share, whether it be on the importance of perhaps Spanish language being used in political campaigns, or some unique ways that your organizations may have in a time of pandemic on how do you get more people registered to vote and get voters out to actually cast a ballot. Raphael, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, because Nathalie should definitely get the last word here, being the Latina powerhouse that she is, and definitely want to hear from her. But I would just say, finally, first of all, I really appreciate our USHLI family, especially our young people that are watching this today. We need all of your leadership involved, and please just, I started in the room or on the computer, if you will, as a college student with this wonderful organization. So I encourage all of you to take your own steps in your own journey and show leadership, because it's sorely needed. I would just say that, the Latino vote is here to stay. We saw not just the impact in tipping the scales for the 2020 election in places like the obvious places like Arizona, Nevada, and other states, but, there's significant Latino communities everywhere. My home state of Pennsylvania, one of the tipping point voting blocks, places like Georgia, Florida, and other places. But we're going to continue to need to invest in telling people the truth about what's happening here, whether it's in language or in a social media platform that they understand. Because one of the things we haven't had a chance to dive in here too much is that we're having to not only combat a very hostile other side of the aisle, if you will, but we're also combating a lot of misinformation that's happening to our community that we have to continue to monitor and hold our social media platforms accountable to. And the last thing I would say in terms of tactics, I'm really excited to announce that the New US Action PAC is actually starting our voter registration in Florida next week, and it's actually doing it with our PAC. So we're actually, traditionally, we've done, in most of our advocacy groups have done voter registration with our C4s, nonpartisan messaging. This gives us the flexibility to kind of provide some messaging to hold elected officials who we believe have been bad actors against our community over the last few years, and provide people just more direct information about the political process. So more to come on that, and really excited to continue to work with all of you to mobilize the Latino vote.
Well, I love
Mark?
that. Latino voters and Latino electeds and Latino leaders are here to stay, and we're not going away. Absolutely. For me, my message is get informed. Find out if you're registered to vote, where you can register if you're not, who is running in your city, your state, federal level, and where and when you can vote, and make a plan to vote. Everyone is an organizer, not only myself or Rafael or Joseph here, or, even Mark organizes as well with his great research, but all of us are organizers. And if you're registered to vote, talk to your family and friends and make sure they are also registered to vote and have a plan to vote. And finally, make sure that you have the correct information to Rafael's point, because misinformation is everywhere, and know about your candidate, who you're considering. And so please be cautious and make sure that you're using legitimate sources to ensure that you're getting the right information. And lastly, representation indeed does matter. We need Latinos at the table because they are part of our community. They understand it from a lived experience rather than a case studies or polls. Having Latinos in our elected government who were born in our neighborhoods, who know our issues firsthand, who have family and friends who live in our communities is most important. And so I ask that if you, not only register to vote, but if you, want to join politics and are looking to run for office, then do it. From local government to state to federal government, there's so many entry points, school boards, where we need Latino leaders to run with that shared experience and those shared values from across the country. So 2 messages to leave you with: register to vote, 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 vote. And if you have that urge in your belly that you want to change your communities, please, please, run. Call us at Latino Victory. We're happy to walk through the process and share more of if you have that urge to run for office to represent your community. So thank you again for this great opportunity to be in conversation with amazing people. And I'll throw it back to Mark for last message.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be here and be a part of this conversation. So thank you to Ushli and thank you to everybody for such a great conversation. And I would say that yes, I think there's an awful lot of great things that are coming down the road with regards to Latino voters, not just in terms of numbers, but I think we're going to continue to see a lot of changes with the way in which we think about it, the way in which we study, and also the results that we see coming out of Latino voters' votes. Where are things going to go? That I think is what's exciting about this, is it shows you that there's an awful lot of opportunity to engage, to organize, and to also encourage family, friends, and those around you to register to vote, to turn out to vote, and to be a part of the electoral process of the country.
Yes, thank you all. I think what has changed a lot too is the age of Latinos. We're a young population, and for so long, our population was so young they weren't old enough to vote. Quite frankly, those who were born in this country or U.S. citizens. Well, that has changed. With every year, there is a new wave of Latinos who are old enough to vote, eligible to vote because they were born here or U.S. citizens. And you can register ahead of time, even though you're not 18. If you're going to be 18 come November, you can register now. So you don't have to wait. So let's get registered. That should be a part of the rites of passage into adulthood with responsibility. I mean, with democracy becomes not only the benefits and privileges, but responsibilities and duties. And voting certainly is one. At Chicanos por la Causa, obviously, we team up with many groups, including Unidos US and others. We'll continue to do so to get more people involved, engaged, educated, and to vote, because the Latino voice is the Latino vote, and to be heard, we must cast a ballot. That is going to make the big difference. So we're all about that, and I know everybody else that's listening to this call and part of this call is doing the same. But there's no guarantee we can just ride the success of 2020 and think it's naturally going to occur. We have to double down, and we have to actually expand and grow it. This election is a very key election, as we all know, and very encouraged of the energy that I hear in everybody's voice, and I know everybody on this call watching too. So, thank you all. Important issue. Get out to vote. Register a friend. Register a family member, and let's make 2022 the year of the Latino at the ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.